Welcome back to our series, Key Battles of World War I. You're now at Key Battle number 9, the Battle of Cambrai. James, ready to talk about tanks?
I am ready. Tanks have been kind of slow and lumbering, and they didn't do a whole lot at first. They didn't accomplish a lot, but they're getting gradually more effective, and here they're really going to have their day in the sun.
Right, and they look interesting if you Google images of World War I tanks. They don't have the big turret on top of them like you would imagine a Sherman tank in World War II. They look more, how do I describe them? It's man, I'm even losing my mathematical terms. James, what's the shape that it's a rectangle, but the two sides are slanted at about 45 degrees?
It's like a parallelogram.
Thank you. It's a gigantic moving, several ton parallelogram.
Yeah, they're really weird.
Yeah, a tiny turret on top. We had talked about tanks in previous battles. This isn't the first battle that we see tanks. And tanks are very much a product of World War I because nations are trying to figure out, how do you cross no man's land? How do you get across there? If you just send your men over the top, they're going to get hit by machine guns and pillboxes. What do you do? The idea comes from British Army Colonel Ernest Swinton and also William Hankey. He's Secretary of the Committee for Imperial Defense. Their idea is to have an armored vehicle with a conveyor-belt-like tracks over its wheels. What that lets you do is break enemy lines, but you can also go over difficult territory. What the men did was appeal to British Navy Minister Winston Churchill, and he liked this idea of what he called a land boat. So he organized the Landships Committee to develop a prototype. In order to keep the project a secret, workers reportedly told the vehicles they were building would be used to carry water on the battlefield. And another theory suggests the shells of the new vehicles resembled water tanks. So anyway, that's how the vehicles shipped in crates labeled tank caused their name to stick. So that's what we call them, tanks today. But let's look at the battle first and the background before we get more into tanks. I'm going to sneak in something that actually has nothing to do with Cambrai. But please.
This is going to be a very short episode, folks. There's really not tons and tons of things to say about it. It doesn't have a million moving parts like something like the Somme or the Marne or Verdun. But I want to wrap up the Eastern Front. We talked 2 episodes ago, or was it 3? I've lost track. A while back, we talked about the Russian revolutions. And so I want to get us caught up on what was going on in the Eastern Front prior to that happening. In November 1916, Emperor Franz Joseph died and was replaced by it wasn't his son, I believe it was a nephew. I forgot to put that in the notes, but Karl, or Charles, Emperor Karl. He's going to be the last emperor of the Habsburg Empire. Emperor Karl removed Konrad von Hotzendorf, who had been the Austrian chief of staff for several years. He replaced him with Arthur von Strausenberg. And in March of 1917, the emperor put out peace feelers to the Allies. He actually starts looking into the possibility of signing a separate peace, bailing on Germany basically and saying, we're done. But nothing came of this. The Allies weren't really interested. On July 1st, 1917, this is in the period where Russia was being ruled by the provisional government, the sort of democratic government under the leadership of Alexander Kerensky. The Bolsheviks had not taken over yet. So on July 1st, 1917, a Russian force of 200,000 led by our old friend Alexei Brusilov, the great Russian general, they began an offensive aimed at Lemberg. They pushed the Austrians back several miles and took thousands of prisoners. And by the 13th, the Russians were approaching the Hungarian border. This offensive is usually called the Kerensky Offensive after the Minister of War / leader of Russia, Alexander Kerensky, who went to the field himself to provide support. On July 19th, German and Austrian forces counterattacked, pushing back the Russians, capturing 6,000 prisoners and causing a rift in the Russian lines. In other words, they were starting to break through. By the end of July, the Russians had begun fleeing and many deserted. They were voting with their feet, as we said before. It's like, we are done. On August 1st, Kerensky replaced Brusilov with another general named Lev Kornilov, or Kornilov, as the Russian commander-in-chief in the east. But the Germans keep pushing forward. On September 1st, they began bombarding the city of Riga, which is in modern-day Latvia. The Russian garrison fell back, and the Germans captured the city. In October, the Germans began an amphibious assault called Operation Albion. By the end of the month, they had captured the islands off the Baltic coast and then landed on the Russian mainland and were threatening Petrograd. And in November 17th, the Russian-German front went silent, of course, because the Bolsheviks gained control and pretty much ended the war. Germany began transferring 500,000 men from the east to the west. So just to kind of make that official, we had touched on some of those things previously, but not necessarily the military details. So that's it. The war in the east ends, as we've already seen, but again, it bears repeating, and many hundreds of thousands of German troops are going to go back to the west to fight in 1918. All right, so now let's move on to Cambrai. We're back on the Western Front now. We saw last time how the British and French had fought a series of horrific and mostly inconclusive battles in 1917, including the Nivelle Offensive, Arras, Messines, and Third Ypres. Third Ypres, by the way, was our last key battle, and we forgot to mention it was key battle number 8. This is going to be key battle number 9, Cambrai. And I'm going to turn it over to Scott for a minute. He's going to talk a little bit more about the background of tanks as they had been used in World War I.
Right, because they are significant in this battle. The first time they appear is in the Battle of the Somme, but they were rushed into the battle because the British were desperate to break the stalemate. Because they were rushed in, the tanks didn't have sufficient testing and the crews weren't trained on this new technology. They'd never trained with infantry units and how to combine them into the assault. Some of the tank commanders, they'd never even fired practice rounds from their guns. So the first time you're using it is in battle. And
is that like on-the-job training?
And that's not a good thing to do on the job. I mean, there's fake it till you make it. That's fine if you have a new job and you don't really know how to use Microsoft Excel and you're figuring out pivot tables. Fine, fake it till you make it on that. Don't fake it till you make it on a tank, which is what happens in the Somme.
No.
So in that battle, of the 49 Mark I tanks that were sent to the battlefield, 17 were sidelined by mechanical failure even before the offensive could begin. Many of them, but anyway, with Cambrai, it's different. When 32 tanks were sent into battle, they were mowed down by barbed wire. They struggled to cross the trenches and artillery craters in no man's land. Some of them were forced to be ditched into the broken ground. This is the Battle of the Somme. I'm just mentioning what it's like to be inside one of these tanks. You had 8-man crews, 2 drivers, and it was hot in there. They didn't vent heat. This isn't...
no AC, Scott?
No AC. I think there were Desert Storm when they had AC in those, and I remember some Vietnam tank commanders would complain just how easy the troops had it. Well, Vietnam guys would not understand at all what it would like to be one of these. This isn't as bad as being in the CMS Hunley, the Confederate submarine. Whenever I think of the worst thing to be trapped in, that's what my mind goes to. So you can at least escape from a World War I tank, but while you're in there, it's hot. The engines are so loud that the crews have to communicate by hand signals. Their 29-ton machines don't offer as much protection as they hope for. When Germans first encounter them, some of them would run away, not really knowing what to do, but others would just fire their machine guns and pistols and grenades and artillery. And if the armor was pierced, then you have scalding metal shards spraying the crews. It's like shrapnel inside. It burns their hands and their faces, so not pleasant in the beginning. But anyway, that's all I just wanted to mention on how tanks are, even though they're better in Cambrai, they're still very unwieldy and very experimental at this time.
Yeah, it would not be a fun assignment. All right, so we talked about these other battles, none of which had gone well in 1917, highlighting in Third Ypres or Passchendaele, which was probably the worst from the British standpoint, the Battle of Mud, basically. But Marshal Haig, Douglas Haig, he tried to make one last push before winter set in. And so he launched another attack. And this is going to be the Battle of Cambrai, which is our 9th key battle. We cheated this time. We've got 12 instead of 10. We just couldn't fit it into just 10. But anyway, it's more episodes for you guys to listen to, right?
Yeah.
All right. So on November 20th, 1917, the battle began at 6 a.m. with a surprise. Can you guess? An artillery.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, with an artillery barrage. Of course, that's how every World War I battle starts, pretty much. 1,000 guns, and then they launched 6 infantry divisions of the British Third Army, supported by 9 tank corps. There were 476 total tanks with, and I keep seeing this in the sources, 378 total fighting tanks. I don't know what the kind of tanks the other 100 were. Water tanks? I don't know. Like non-fighting tanks?
It's like escorts that you have in a flotilla. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe so. They just weren't fully equipped for battle. I could never nail down exactly what the difference is between a fighting tank and a not fighting tank. But anyway you slice it, this is a lot of tanks for World War I. This is huge. 378 fully armed tanks are heading out toward the Germans. They also had 300 supporting aircraft. So a pretty impressive force, a mixed force the British are launching. And sure enough, the tanks broke through the Hindenburg Line up to 4 miles deep. The British captured 8,000 prisoners and 100 guns on the first day alone. But by then, 180 tanks were already out of the action. One German soldier is believed to have taken out 7 tanks all by himself. How about that, Mr. Anti-Tank? I don't know. I don't know what his name was, but that's pretty impressive to take out 7 tanks. I'm sure if he lived, he got quite a few awards for that. Here's a quote from a German lieutenant. This is a very interesting quote. It's a little on the long side, but it's worth listening to. The German lieutenant said this: "When the first tanks passed the first line, we thought we would be compelled to retreat toward Berlin. I remember one tank by the name of Hyena, which advanced very far and suddenly stopped about 1,000 yards from my little dugout. Some of the boys discovered they could stop the tanks by throwing a hand grenade into the manhole at the top. Once this was known, the boy realized there was a blind spot, that the machine guns couldn't reach every point around the tank, and these points were very important in the defense. I was shocked and felt very sorry for those fellows in the tanks because there was no escape for them."
Yep, they found the weakness. They found the soft belly of the dragon.
That's absolutely. Yeah. I think about in The Hobbit, Bard, who shot that arrow at that one little spot on the dragon. But that's from G.J. Meyer, A World Undone, which is my favorite 1-volume history of World War I. I highly recommend that. The tanks were really doing a lot of damage at first, but over time, the Germans discovered their weak spots. They also rushed a new German division into place. This is a fresh division. They halted the British advance. Nevertheless, despite this stopping of the advance, the British saw this as their greatest victory of the war. Church bells tolled throughout Great Britain, and that was the first time this had happened during the entire war. So, not a truly great victory for the British, but nevertheless, they're starting to make a little bit of progress. Something good, some good news for the people back home.
Yeah, 6 miles, if nothing else, to feel like you're escaping the trenches. That much movement is absolutely incredible on the Western Front. It's like the deep freeze, the deadlock of the last several years is finally starting to thaw.
Exactly. Now, the Germans, of course, they're not done by any stretch of the imagination. They counterattacked. At Berlin Wood, the Germans pushed the British back. They also recovered 100 captured guns. The next day, the British dug into a salient, which is always a precarious position. A salient is basically a big bulge that points into the other side. November 30th, the Germans attacked swiftly, taking large casualties and gaining ground, but they were stopped by the British tanks. And on December 3rd, the Germans captured a town called La Vacquerie, and nearly all British gains had been erased. Gas was lingering everywhere. So they basically, because of the gas and because of the weather, they had to call off the fighting. So again, another in a long, long series of battles where the attacking side seems to make progress, but then they're driven back, and then the defenders counterattack and retake all the ground that was taken by the attackers. Does that sound familiar, Scott?
It's constantly back and forth. When I hear this, my mind goes to an article in The Onion, and it's a fictional article from World War I, and it's something like 400,000 soldiers die to capture 6 inches of land. And then there's a fake quote from Woodrow Wilson that this half foot is now liberated from the whip of tyranny. And I mean, you laugh at just the sadness of it all, that so much sacrifice, so much planning, and there's a few days of joy. You have this new weapon and you feel like the deadlock is being broken, and then it's gone.
Right. Yeah. You got to give kudos to the Germans, because we have to remember that these soldiers are just about starving by this point. They're consuming 1,000, 1,200 calories a day, and they're running out of supplies, and yet they still fight like there's no tomorrow. They're defending their homeland. At least they feel like they are. They're still in France technically, but their fighting spirit is simply amazing. The Allies, and this is going to happen in World War II, they're going to just say, you guys are beaten. Why don't you just give up? But Germans don't give up. All right, let's move into the results of the battle. Total casualties were about 40,000 on each side, which sounds like a lot, but that's actually really small compared to some of the other battles that we've seen. There were around 9,000 British and 11,000 German prisoners taken. But one of the key things of this is that both sides learned that tanks, when properly deployed, could have a big effect on battle, particularly with breaking through barbed wire. Germany showed the effectiveness of combining stormtroop attacks, gas, artillery, and trench mortars. The London Times called the battle one of the most ghastly stories in English history. And then I've got a couple more quotes from G.J. Meyer. He really has a way with words and really sums things up well. This is what he said about the Battle of Cambrai. Yet another British offensive had been for nothing. It had not, however, been without meaning. Generals on both sides saw that the new tanks, if properly used, could have produced very different results, that Cambrai was a sign of things to come. And then, if I may, one more quote from Meyer, wrapping up the year of 1917. He says, and so ended 1917. On the Western Front, the year had taken the lives of 226,000 British, 136,000 French, and 121,000 German soldiers. And still, the stalemate continued. Between them, Arras, the Nivelle offensive, 3rd Ypres, and Cambrai had rendered the French and the British incapable of mounting a major offensive at the end of the approaching winter. At the same time, they had destroyed the Germans' confidence in their defensive system. These two facts would shape the year ahead. They would put the conflict on the road to its end at last. And there we go. So not a very sunny assessment to what happened in 1917 for the Allies or for the Germans.
Right. It's almost like there's not a victor. The two sides are just whittled down into something so small that the war ends simply for a lack of combatants at one point. If from one sense, it seems like. One other thing I want to mention is the quote that you mentioned about tanks, a sign of things to come. There really is a lot of World War I, or a sign of things to come, that there are tactics from the 19th century. There's technology that it seems like an anachronism, but it's still being used, of cavalry charges. You still see a cavalry charge and a cavalry division right next to machine guns and airplanes, and this new technology that's emerging that's going to define the 20th century. In the Middle East, you have camels. They're being used as pack animals by the millions in the Ottoman Empire and elsewhere. And General Patton, well, not general at the time, but with his experience with tanks in World War I, he has comments about their future potential. At the time, even though tanks were a newfangled technology, there was a lot of argument and debate about what do you do with them? How are they combined into the overall military strategy? Do they go alongside infantry? Do we treat them like cavalry? They're sort of like cavalry. It's a mechanized horse. So are they their own separate division? They will be their own division later, but that's not the case here. So after World War I, what Patton wrote is that tanks are not motorized cavalry. They are tanks, a new auxiliary arm whose purpose is ever and always to facilitate the advance of the master arm, the infantry on the field of battle. So before the next war, before World War II, he recognized that tanks could be an offensive force on their own. And tanks dominate 20th century warfare, especially World War II, when the Nazi panzer divisions devastate Europe, and they're a central part of their blitzkrieg attacks. And the defenses that France and others set up before World War II are completely rolled over by tanks and other technology. So we're seeing glimmers of their potential. But much like airplanes, there's only glimmers, and they're going to come into fruition later. So that's about all I have to say on this battle. Anything else you want to add, James?
That's all I have.
All right. Well, Germany is pushed back. They return it, and they are going to go on the offensive. So in the next episode, we're going to be looking at key battle. Is it 10? Do I have that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Number 10.
Key battle 10. Okay. The 1980 German Spring Offensives.